Hey, this is Zulem Urbina, and tune into the relay for the latest news in boxing all around the world. Thank you for supporting myself and other female boxers. We truly appreciate it.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news. Ow!
Okay, we'll start with this per tweet from Michael Benson. Bob Arum has declared that they will try to make Tyson Fury versus Dillian Whyte as a voluntary defense for March at Cardiff's Principality Stadium, if Alexander Usyk is not an option.
We're gonna sit down with Whyte's people and see if we can work out a deal. I talked to him, and if Dillian Whyte is reasonable as far as his money, happy to fight him. If not, we'll fight Joyce.
Few thoughts on this. In spite of Bob Arum's comments, I'm not convinced Fury versus Whyte happens. They're already entertaining other options for Tyson Fury. Bob Arum made some mention of the money, and I've no doubts that Dillian Whyte doesn't plan to fight on the cheap. He's built a name for himself over there in the United Kingdom. He is a draw in his own right to some extent. And if the money's not right, the fight don't happen.
This isn't the first we've heard of Fury versus Joyce.
This potential matchup was tabbed weeks ago, and we actually talked about it here on the channel, and how it creates an easier situation than a Dillian Whyte fight. You have to understand that if Tyson Fury's next fight is in the United Kingdom, Old Fish Eyes Frank Warren will have the rights for the fight. Dillian Whyte, being a network and promotional free agent, he would be able to have the fight on BT Sport without issue, but what about the money? Will Frank Warren pay Dillian the way he wants to get paid?
The cheaper alternative would be Joyce.
Who is one of Frank Warren's boys. He's currently under contract with Queensberry. It's an easier fight to make, a cheaper alternative to a Dillian Whyte fight. Dillian Whyte himself stated, "I'll finish him. Deontay Wilder is overrated. He can punch, but he can't fight. He knocked Fury down twice, heavy knockdowns, and Fury came back and won rounds. If I put Fury down, I'll be attacking him, head and body." He will try to fight Usyk because Usyk is a much easier fight for him. Fury's thinking, I've got so much more height than him, I can keep him at range, whereas with me, he knows I've put him down before and can put him down again. I talked about this a little over a week ago and how Tyson Fury's next fight happening in the United Kingdom poses a unique problem. Even with Dillian Whyte being a network and promotional free agent able to cross over to Queensberry and BT Sport for the fight, the question would then become, is Frank Warren willing to pay Dillian the way he wants to get paid? Because Dillian's not going to fight in a fight like this on the cheap. And not but a few days ago, we heard Bob Arum chime in on the situation, saying things like they're going to pay
80-20.
Dillian Whyte 20% of whatever's in the pot.
Dillian's not going to go for that.
Now, as a mandatory challenger, Dillian Whyte would be entitled to more than just 20%. The problem is the WBC haven't ordered the fight. They haven't ordered the fight because they're in the middle of an arbitration process with Dillian Whyte and his legal team. Thus, as a voluntary challenger, whatever's on the table for him is at the discretion of Tyson Fury's handlers, Tyson Fury's team. And it sounds like what they want to give Dillian is only 20%.
Dillian's not going to go for that.
Understand, this is a major fight in the United Kingdom. Arguably, the second biggest fight that could happen on UK soil. And Dillian's not going to fight in that fight for a meager 20%. That percentage is not a good faith percentage. It's not an earnest effort to see the fight get done. If the most you're going to offer this guy is something to the tune of 20%, you can't be doing so with intentions of seeing the fight get over the line. Months ago, when Dillian Whyte first sought legal counsel situation with the WBC, the move was celebrated. The move was interpreted as a long overdue move because the WBC have been playing with Dillian Whyte, playing with his career, and it's about time he did something about it. It seemed like a good move back then, but here and now it doesn't seem like a move that's aged very well. We'll see how it all turns out because this is the WBC's latest excuse to hold out on ordering this fight. Did Dillian Whyte shoot himself in the foot?
He might have.
And if Tyson Fury moves on from this, and he doesn't fight Dillian Whyte next, he ends up fighting Joyce, how should that be interpreted? Can that be considered an according to Hoyle duck? Joyce ain't got the resume that Dillian Whyte has, so let's just get that right out of the way. Dillian Whyte has faced more top 10 opponents and world-class operators than Joyce had, though does that mean that Joyce is no threat at all to Tyson Fury? How could a fight like that be interpreted? How should it be interpreted?
Still a good fucking fight.
Dillian Whyte and Joyce both have the ability to play the aggressor, the pressure fighter that applies pressure, as it were, though they go about it in different ways. Dillian Whyte is more of a herky-jerky, bob and weave under the hooks kind of guy, body snatcher kind of guy, whereas Joe's bit more upright, fights behind his jab that he steps into to pile on the damage the way he did with Daniel Dubois. I think comparatively, Joyce might have better punch resistance than Dillian. Joyce is undefeated after all. He's never been knocked out, whereas Dillian has 2 times in his pro career. It's a curious situation because what you have to ask yourself is, does Joyce pose the same threat to Tyson Fury that Dillian Whyte might, that Dillian Whyte does? Tyson Fury has 2 very big wins on his professional record. The Vladimir Klitschko fight, the Wilder fight. Dillian Whyte is nowhere near as cautious and careful as Vladimir, and he's a more prolific puncher, bar none. More prolific than Deontay Wilder. Deontay Wilder has one-hitter-quitter power, but he's not a busy puncher. He's not a volume guy. Dillian Whyte is.
Even if you have Fury winning that fight, do you have him winning that fight easy?
We saw what Sweden's own Otto Wallin did to Tyson Fury by applying some pressure. Could Dillian Whyte do better than that? And if he can, what does that say about Joyce? Does Joyce pose the same threat to Tyson Fury that Dillian Whyte might?
He's a pressure guy, yeah.
Though he does apply it differently than Dillian. He's not as much of a body puncher. He's not as much of a hooker. Tyson Fury will walk into this Joyce fight, if that's the fight that happens, with considerable experience and a speed advantage. Slow-mo Joe, he hits hard, he's got a chin, but he ain't the fastest guy.
He's there for the right hands.
Just gonna be honest with you here. I don't think that Fury versus Whyte is gonna happen. I think the reason we keep hearing the name of Joyce is because that's who Tyson Fury's gonna be fighting early next year. And while I don't think that's a bad fight, it doesn't exactly reconcile the situation between Dillian Whyte, the WBC, and Tyson Fury, the reigning champion.
What's your thoughts on Shakur Stevenson wanting to fight Oscar Valdez? Valdez said that it only makes sense for them to fight each other next. What's your thoughts on making that fight happen next?
Who says that?
Oscar Valdez. He said it only makes sense to have that fight happen next.
Well, they tell me different. They tell me that they want to do the Navarette fight, and Navarette wants to do the Valdez fight. So that fight will happen. Meanwhile, Shakur, there's a lot of fights we can make for Shakur.
You heard that right, ladies and gentlemen. Uncle Bob Arum himself says Oscar Valdez will defend his WBC super featherweight title against Emmanuel Navarette next. Emmanuel Navarette, reigning WBO
featherweight champion,
who will have to move up in weight for this fight, according to Bob Arum. He added that he wants to make Vasyl Lomachenko versus Shakur Stevenson. These are just my thoughts. I've long since felt that there's something about a southpaw, who also happens to be a jabber, that bothers Oscar Valdez, and that's why he didn't go right into that fight with Jamel Herring. Jamel Herring moved on from that situation. That never materialized. He fights Shakur Stevenson, loses the title, and now Shakur, another southpaw, who is also a very good jabber, stick and move kind of fighter, cerebral guy, the kind of guy Oscar don't want to deal with. Oscar don't want to fight.
Oscar doesn't like that style.
The pure boxer, the moving target, the counterpuncher. He knows that style doesn't do him any favors. That's why he didn't want to fight Jamel Herring, and that's why he doesn't want to fight Shakur Stevenson here and now. He'd rather take his chances with Emmanuel Navarette, a come-forward pressure guy, a southpaw, yes, though all the same.
An action fighter.
An action fighter whose base style caters to Oscar Valdez's strengths.
Plays into them.
At least a little better than Jamel Herring's base style did, or Shakur Stevenson's base style, for that matter. Somebody tells me that they feel that Oscar Valdez is avoiding Shakur Stevenson. There's very little arguments that can be made against that contention, against that notion. Why fight a featherweight who's moving up in weight to super featherweight when you got a world champion right there on your same side of the street?
And if you like your chances, you do the fight.
You win yourself a second world title. Now, if you don't like your chances, you fight a featherweight moving up to super featherweight in Emmanuel Navarette, because for you, that might seem like a safer choice. Bob's talking about making a Shakur Stevenson versus Vasyl Lomachenko fight, a showdown between them. I don't think that fight happens next or after next. First, Vasyl Lomachenko's got to make it past Richard Commey, former IBF lightweight champion Richard Commey, whereas Shakur, he's still down there at super featherweight.
I could see Shakur fighting Miguel Berchelt.
Maybe next or after next. I don't think Shakur is about to move up to the lightweight division. Now, should Vasyl Lomachenko make it past Richard Commey later on this year, the way I think it might break down is Vasyl Lomachenko could see himself reclaiming at least one of his old world titles next year. because he's ranked #1 by way of the WBO, and essentially what that means is he's in a pole position to challenge the winner of Lopez versus Kambosos. Teofimo Lopez, he doesn't want to give Vasyl Lomachenko the time of day. He doesn't want to give him that rematch. So that creates a situation to where either Teofimo's going to move up in weight or he's going to vacate the WBO title.
Because he doesn't want to give Loma a rematch.
If he makes it past Richard Comey this year, and next year some WBO final eliminator is ordered between Vasyl Lomachenko and Denis Beranchyk, or just one of those guys in their top 10, the WBO, Paco Veracel, he's not going to leave Teofimo with much of a choice. You're either going to take care of your mandatory, or you're going to have to come up out of that title. And because Teofimo's talking all this stuff about Josh Taylor,
Maybe he'll move up and see about getting that fight.
so let's say Vasyl Lomachenko sees himself becoming a champion again in the lightweight division. Thereafter, I can see that Shakur Stevenson fight happening. I could see it happening for a world title in the lightweight division. But what we're talking about is essentially 2 to maybe 3 fights from now.
Not right away.
If Loma beats Comey and Teofimo doesn't give him a rematch, perhaps surrenders the WBO title or all the alphabet titles at 135 by moving up in weight, and
Loma picks one of them up.
or all of them, I could definitely see Shakur Stevenson taking him on in a scenario like that. That might come to pass because, let's be honest,
Who's really left at 135 that can beat Vasyl Lomachenko?
outside of Lopez, who's out there? That is, who's out there that he might actually fight? Finally, ahead of this weekend's big welterweight showdown between the reigning WBO champion Terence Crawford and the 2-time former champion Shawn Porter, Shawn said, "This isn't only Crawford versus Porter, this is Top Rank versus the PBC."
That's exactly what it is.
Immediately after Spence versus Porter, way back when in 2019, Spence's fans, their outcry, it wasn't for Errol Spence to move on from that unification match with Shawn to go into another unification match with Terence. What they wanted
Was for Shawn to fight Terence.
that's what they were asking for, and that is what's set to go down on Saturday night.
So I hope you're happy.
In light of all of this, it brings to mind the old proverb, be careful what you wish for, because you just might get it. Shawn's going to get it on Saturday night. As far as the fight, I mean, I made my prediction in reference to it well over a year ago in 2019. Here it is for those that missed it. What do I think would happen if you put Terence Crawford and Shawn Porter in the ring at the same time? I will say that this is where Terence Crawford's previous experiences with smaller fighters that can really move, have a low center of gravity, and know how to angle their torsos, this is where his experiences with the likes of a Yuriorkis Gamboa, his experiences with the likes of a Felix Diaz, this is where those experiences would really service him. I will say, comparatively, that Shawn Porter is a more durable fighter than those guys. He's got a better chin than a Felix Diaz, and he's got a better chin than a Yuriorkis Gamboa. You know, that's what he's got on those guys.
He takes a better punch.
But what makes those fights similar is that Terence Crawford would be a guy with a height advantage and a reach advantage, and the task before him would be controlling the room and the real estate so that he can continue to fight his fight, as opposed to being drawn into Shawn's fight, like how Errol Spence was drawn into Shawn's fight. I talked about it in my weekend recap video, how, you know, it became very clear early in the fight, painfully obvious, that Errol Spence's jab has been diffused because you really can't stop this guy from getting into his desired range. He's constantly closing the gap on you, and you can do little more than engage him in what is his fight, because we all know Shawn Porter is a phone booth fighter. Well, I don't think that would happen to Terence Crawford, because it just so happens that Terence Crawford has more experience in that area than Errol Spence had ahead of that Shawn Porter fight.
How so?
In the Yuriorkis Gamboa fight, in the Felix Diaz fight, Terence Crawford was faced with a task to where he's got to be able to nail the smaller fighter coming in. Now, in the Gamboa fight, you know, back when Gamboa was undefeated, you know, he was a fresher guy. This is a fighter who's light on his feet. He's very nimble. He's got in and out game. He knows how to be elusive, good hand speed. He's got all these things, and he brings these things to the table to help him close the gap on what is a more statuesque fighter than himself. And this is a fight where Terence Crawford struggled. I mean, Gamboa had moments in this fight. We all know how it worked out. We all know that eventually Terence Crawford bounced his ass off the fucking canvas like a football, you know? So there's that. And he took those experiences over to the Felix Diaz fight. He had those experiences with Gamboa to draw from in the Diaz fight. And in the Diaz fight, he didn't struggle at all, you know, with that guy. And it's a similar situation to where you're facing a fighter who's a smaller guy with a lower center of gravity who can really move, but still has to close the gap to get to you because he's the smaller fighter. There's no way the smaller guy's going to be able to fight the fight from the outside. You're a sitting duck out there. So both a Gamboa and a Diaz and a Sean Porter, they have that same task in front of them to where they have to close the gap to fight their fight. And it is there where Crawford's previous experiences would serve him the best, that he has the kind of accuracy, the kind of sharpshooting abilities that Errol Spence didn't have, because up until that Porter fight, he was never faced with that kind of an opponent, that kind of a situation, whereas Terrence Crawford has been here at least 2 times already against two, count them, 2 Olympic gold medalists, because need I remind you, Yuriorkis Gamboa, Felix Diaz, they both came from an Olympic background, and they were both Olympic gold medalists. And the underlying principle of those fights, the dynamic of those situations, is very similar to the dynamic of a Sean Porter situation, because he's got to get within his desired range the same way they did. And what would be required of Crawford is to fight on the fly. But not just fighting on the fly for sake of fighting on the fly, not just sticking and moving, but being accurate, being a sharpshooter, catching the guy with jabs over the top as he's trying to come in, walking him into shots like lead uppercuts. You know what kind of fight Sean Porter wants to fight. You know where he needs to be to fight that fight. And in that way, you can anticipate his movements. This is something that Terrence Crawford has had to do in the past, and it's likely what he would do with Sean Porter. My prediction for such a fight, is that Terrence Crawford would stop Sean Porter, and he'd stop him late. Sean Porter, I reiterate, is a more durable guy than a Yuriorkis Gamboa. He's a more durable guy than a Felix Diaz. So it would be one of the more physically taxing fights that Terrence Crawford will have been in. But he's got the kind of accuracy, the kind of mobility, the switch hitting that he can attack Sean Porter from different angles, even whilst on the fly. He can attack him as an orthodox fighter or a southpaw. Whatever works and whatever is needed in the moment. Because we all know Terrence Crawford adapts on the go. And Terrence Crawford, unlike Errol Spence, he doesn't need to be at a particular range throwing a particular set of punches to generate power. Terrence Crawford generates as much power with his straight punches as he does with his bent arm punches, with his hooks. He doesn't need to be in a particular range to fire off power shots, and they all got a lot of mustard on them. I'll say that I think the fight would test Crawford's physicality. I mean, if it really were going to be a litmus test for something, it would be that. It would be Crawford's condition. If there's anything that would be tested in that fight, when it comes to Crawford, it would be his physicality. But accuracy, being a sniper, being a sharpshooter, that's what would win him the fight. And I've no doubts that's a fight he would win. Will win on Saturday night. My prediction is Terrence Crawford by way of knockout or technical knockout. Late.